Thanks, Christine, and thanks very much to all of you for coming today. My background is really that I've been working in stakeholder engagement, excuse me, fundraising and philanthropy for about 20 years. And up until 4 years ago, I was working at Murdoch University as the head of development, communications and marketing there with a team of people who were involved in a whole range of things, including grants. And since then, I've morphed into a consultant. It wasn't something I'd planned to do, but it just happened that way. And I now work with a range of organisations, helping them with their stakeholder engagement, income diversity, fundraising and philanthropy. And obviously grants is a significant part of that. So a few things that I'm going to cover with you today. I'm going to talk a little bit about grants generally, the importance of them and what makes them successful. But I'm going to particularly talk to you about sources of grants. And obviously we have some great representatives in the room from funding agencies, but I'd like to identify some others that you might not have considered. So as a starting point, a golden retriever owner. So gratuitous pictures of golden retrievers may come up during my presentation, and I expect you to smile at those when they do. What I'd like to do is consider the situation that we find ourselves in now. So can I just ask very quickly around the room, and obviously for the webinar people, think about it for yourselves. Can you tell me, put your hand up if you represent an organisation that provides grants? Okay, so there are a few of you in the room, and can I ask you to just let me know, just in case there are others in between, those of you that seek grants. Okay, so I hope you were all looking around at the time, because my job may well be done now. Partner you all up and I can walk out of the room. Okay, so the critical thing when you think about your dependence on grants is to ask yourself a particular question, and that is, if you look back as an agency that looks for grants, if you look back over the last 10 years, what is the percentage of your income that comes from grants? And consider where the rest of the funding comes from and how dependent you are on grants, and what a risk that provides for your organisation. So I know a number of organisations recently have done that calculation, and it's caused them concern, and it's caused their board members concern, because what it means is quite possibly that they may be at risk if funding from grants suddenly ceases or changes. And we know even from today that we have one organisation that was coming and now wasn't able to because of restructure. We know that the environment changes constantly, and we need to be aware of that. So the ideal situation for grants is where you have these Labradors, by the way, not golden retrievers, so it's not quite the same, but the ideal situation for grants is where you have a positive partnership, where you have a clear direction, where the organisation that's providing the funding and the organisation that's seeking the funding are heading in the same direction with the same goals. Where you don't have that is where you start to have problems. What I'd particularly like to talk about now is the potential sources of grants. So I'll go through some of these in a little more detail than others, because I think that for many organisations that are represented here, particularly those that seek grants, you're very used to the idea of seeking grants from governments, whether it's local, state or federal, and government entities. But what I'd encourage you to think about is the others that you can see there. So particularly corporate and commercial businesses. There are more and more of those now that are providing grants to not-for-profit organisations. And I don't mean sponsorships, and I don't mean donations. They do continue to do those sorts of things, but they are definitely setting up grant programs. So for example, one that might very well be relevant to some of you here today, Horizon. Has anyone heard of Horizon? Okay, and I'm not talking about Horizon as in Horizon Power, who may very well be moving into WA, but Horizon is the largest freight rail network provider in Australia. And they provide grants between $1,000 and $20,000, and they do it twice a year. So it's not a huge grant, but they provide it in areas in which the rail network goes. So if you're based or you have programs in Geraldton, Esperance, Kalgoorlie, then you might apply for an Horizon. And of other organisations that are providing those sorts of grants, it's well worth being aware of them. There are some challenges that go along with those kind of grants, because obviously there is a reason for them to do it, and it's always more than simply corporate social responsibility. So when you start to think back to the picture of the two Labradors, are the goals that they have the same as the goals that you have? And if not, you have to think very carefully about those. But I think the largest area of growth in grants over the last 10 to 15 years is in trusts and foundations. So there are now thousands and thousands of them across Australia. It used to be that many of the philanthropic trusts and foundations were based in Melbourne because of the tax laws over there and for a number of other reasons which are historic, so I won't go into them. But now they are based across the country, and particularly private ancillary funds. So there are now thousands of private ancillary funds across Australia, and they currently hold approximately $11 billion in capital, and they have to give money away every year. It's not optional, it's part of their obligation to the ATO. And the largest one of those was set up just over a year ago, and many of you will have heard of this. Anyone heard of the Paul Ramsay Foundation? Okay, so a couple of nods around the room. Paul Ramsay was the gentleman who set up Ramsay Health, moved into education, hospitality, an international firm, and he died a couple of years ago. And he left a significant bequest which set up the Paul Ramsay Foundation, $3 billion, which is the largest trust fund in Australia. And interestingly, if you do the calculation according to the ATO's requirements, that organisation has to give away approximately $1 million a day. That's it, $1 million a day, every day, forever. So that's the way that kind of private ancillary fund is set up. And since that organisation was set up, they've given 5 major grants across a range of interesting areas: educational, Aboriginal health, teaching, whole range of interesting things. But they are large grants, $10 million over 4 years, $8 million over 3 years. So they are not small things. They are looking for innovative programs that are going to have impact and make a difference, hopefully in pilot programs that can then be rolled out into other places. So it is worth considering organisations like that. When you start to think about the potential for organisations and grants like that, it's worth bearing in mind that because they have a philanthropic feel to them, it doesn't mean that they are any easier to get or any easier to deal with than government grants. They have the same kind of requirements, you'll go through the same kind of processes, and you'll need to fill in similar kinds of application forms. So it's not an easy option, but it is a growing option, and many of them will have the same sorts of goals that you have, so they're certainly worth considering. I've put other organisations on the bottom because there are organisations that manage trusts and foundations, and it's worth you being aware of those. For example, perpetual trustees. So perpetual trustees give away grants from the trusts that they manage, and they give away grants from $10,000 up to $200,000, and they do that once a year. Their grants are not open yet, but they will be open later in the year, and generally it's about September, October time. And they are very unusual because they are one of the organisations that will provide funding for operating costs. And how many of us need those kind of things on a regular basis? So it's worth considering them. Because they have over 1,000 trusts and foundations that they manage, you won't know which trust or foundation your application might be relevant to, and they accept many, many applications. But it is worth considering them because of the amount of money that they have and the amount of money that they give away. And there are several others. ANZ Trustees, JB Ware, and some of the other banks do the same kind of thing. Having said that, when you look at those trusts and foundations and the other organisations that manage them, and sometimes corporate and commercial businesses, there's one particular requirement that most of them have, and that is that you have deductible gift recipient status. So any concerns or questions in the room about DGR status? Anybody not understand what that's about? Okay, so if you are a registered charity and you have one of the categories that the ATO designates, you can be a deductible gift recipient status organisation. And that means if someone gives you a donation, like me, off the street to the Red Cross or to someone else, then you can give me a tax deduction. So even though trusts and foundations might give you grants, which aren't in some cases technically donations, they still want you to have DGR status because it means that someone like the ATO has gone through all of your paperwork and given you a tick of credibility, regardless of whether they get a tax deduction in return. That's not what they're after. It's a credibility kind of thing. Interestingly, when I looked through the organisations that are registered for this forum and those that are attending the webinar, about 50% of you have DGR status, and almost all of the organisations that are grant seeking have DGR status. For those of you that don't have it, and of the list that I looked at, there was only 2 who are charities but don't have DGR status, then find one that you can partner with to put in a grant application to someone like Perpetual or others. Collaborations are always a good positive thing for them. If you don't have DGR status but you have charitable status, you might think about having a good look at your constitution, and if there's a reason for you to change it in the future, see if you can modify it so you can get DGR status, or as I say, partner with another organisation. So a critical thing if you use any of those grant funding sources is balance. It's determining and having clarity around your mission, your vision and what you want to achieve, and then balancing that with what the granting organisation wants to fund. And there are tricks and there are traps with that. So it is very easy for an organisation to suddenly hear that the Paul Ramsay Foundation is giving away grants of $8 million over 4 years and then try and develop a proposal that will be successful in seeking a grant. But is that what your organisation has a priority in the first place? So are you chasing your priorities, or are you moving to where funding opportunities are? And in some cases that's okay, because if the funding agency is providing something to do with injury or safety or health promotion and it fits, it may be an area that you're thinking about moving into. But be very careful about the trap of following the money. I guess the other thing that's really important is being realistic. There are a lot of organisations that I've worked with over the years that will go for grants that are about $5,000 because it may allow you to do something. But if you end up with 10 grants of $5,000, that is 10 times as much work as one grant of $50,000, and you may end up looking like this little creature here. It is a very difficult thing to determine what's an appropriate grant for you to seek. So I would encourage you within your organisation to ensure that you have a policy, and perhaps that policy says we don't get out of bed for less than $10,000 a day. We don't seek grants of less than $10,000 or $50,000 because we know the amount of work that goes into it. So do consider those kind of things when you're making decisions about your grant processes. When you are thinking about applying for grants, you know that the grant process will be quite clear-cut in most cases. Not always, and particularly with some of the philanthropic trusts and foundations, and we have a few here in Perth that are have interesting structures, the McCusker Charitable Foundation, the Perrin Charitable Foundation. They're not quite as strict about the processes as some of the other large trusts and foundations, and particularly the national-based ones. But whenever you go through that process, it's very useful to focus on the impact and the outcome of the grant and the impact and the outcome of your work, and help people understand how they can impact and how they can be involved. It's good to start with a storyline. And in most cases when I do it, it's about what's the problem, and that's what's the community problem, not the problem that you have that you don't have enough staff and there's no administrative support and we need a new office, but what's the problem that relates to the impact that you're going to deliver? What's the solution? Why are you the right people to provide the solution, and who says so? Do you have letters of support? Do you have others who will speak for you? And then how can they help? In most situations, particularly if you have a chance to talk to someone about a grant, most situations people will start talking about their organisation, how long it's existed, what they do, how many staff they have, who's on the board and so on, without talking about impact and outcome. And that's really what grant funders want to know. So for example, in this poor situation here, it's quite possible, let's assume these are firemen, it's quite possible that the firemen will say that the problem here is that they just don't have the equipment that they need to get the horse out of the hole. But perhaps the problem is that horses keep falling into these holes and they need to do something about that. So it's not about them, it's not about their work, it's about the impact that their work can have. So asking the right question is sometimes the thing that you need to do. So the next step in terms of grant success is clearly identifying and working with the appropriate partners. And that involves research, and it's not difficult to do that. The organisations that I've worked with over the last few years, we set up a whole range of things. We have the policy that says what will apply for, what we won't apply for, and then we start to do the research on the organisations that provide funding and try and find a match in terms of their corporate objectives, the outcomes that they want, and those that match with our mission and vision. One of the very important things, I know you'll understand this, is listening for both sides. So what we often tend to do is talk to grant funding agencies about what we want to deliver, what our outcomes are, what we want to achieve, without asking the questions in the first place about what they want. What are the government's objectives at the moment? What are the things or the problems that you have that we can help you to solve? So listening and not talking too much is a good thing. It's all about how we can do it together. The other thing for me is really about process. It's keeping things clean, tidy and in order. Do we have anyone from Lottery West here? Okay, I believe we're having a Lottery West speaker, so I'm sure they'll be along at some stage. But I have what I call the Lotto principle. And the Lotto principle used to be the get run over by a bus principle, but now it's the Lotto principle. And that is, I assume that in any team that I work with, they will have a syndicate Lotto ticket, and they will all win and leave on the same day. So everything needs to be in place, not necessarily in the dishwasher, but a grant calendar, a process for tracking grants, policies and procedures, an operational plan that relates to grant funding, that they will have subscribed to particular newsletters and there'll be a record of those, organisations like Pro Bono who send you information. So it's really about keeping on top of all of those sorts of things, and it's particularly important when you start to think about reporting and acquittals. You can't just wait for the last 5 minutes to get that done. You have to keep on top of it. So I'd encourage you to think about that as you go through. And then bear in mind that there will always at some stage be something unexpected. And I'm not sure if you can see what's behind the boat on this one. Just have a careful look if you can't. Be prepared for the unexpected, and that's obviously based on open communication. Can anyone not see the picture behind the boat? You can't see it? Okay, good. That's good. You can never tell depending on lighting. And then clearly work with organisations to celebrate the successes, particularly if you're going in the right direction and you're starting to have some outcomes. One of the things that when I was working at Murdoch University, we received a $5 million grant from Lottery West, which was the largest grant that they'd given at that time for research projects, because they're very careful about what they do at universities. And our goal was to be creative in celebrating that grant, because we understood that it was a tick of credibility for the university to get a grant of that size, particularly considering a Murdoch sat in terms of the size of the other universities. So we put a great big sign at the front of the university, a digital sign that was there, changed the wording to celebrate the grant, and then senior people across the university for a month changed their email signature and put at the bottom of it, with Lottery West approval, celebrating a grant from Lottery West to help overcome HIV/AIDS. So think about how you can do that creatively. And then finally, make time for reflection. Think about the things that you've achieved with your grants. Think about your systems and processes and evaluate what you do. Be prepared to be nimble and flexible with the organisations that you work with, because there are definitely increased expectations in the marketplace. The grant funding scene is definitely changing. We know that government changes and restructures, and we have to be nimble and flexible to be prepared for that. But we know that there are increasing number of grant sources in other places, and identifying those may give you an opportunity in the future. And then just to finish off, I'm not sure, but this is a gratuitous picture which makes me smile every time I see it. I'm happy to take some questions. It was a very relevant picture when there was swine flu around. Yes.
I have a question for the webinar. What was the name of the the organisation or the trust that offers operational grants?
Perpetual trustees. Okay. Perpetual trustees, and their grants usually open around September or October. If you just Google them, you will find them. So they have a grant round which is advertised each year, ready for the following year. So if you look on Perpetual Trustees website, you'll read about Perpetual Trustees 2017 grants, but those are the grants that have been given out in 2017. So what you're looking for is the 2018 round, which will come up later this year. Yes, Amy.
I was just wondering, is there any website or online resource available that might list the range of trusts or other funding sources available?
There are some that you can subscribe to and pay, and there are others that you can subscribe to that will send you information, but there are a few of those. So any of you that are really interested and aren't sure, just send me an email and I'll send you out a few resources that could be useful, or if your preference is, I'll send them to Amy and then she can distribute them to you. So as I mentioned, Pro Bono is one of those organisations that you just sign up for their newsletter, and every time the newsletter comes out, there's a list of new grants. And Fundraising and Philanthropy is a magazine you can subscribe to, but they also have a newsletter which lists grants that are coming out. So what I do is I just keep track of it all. If I see something, I just write it down, then do some research and stick it in my calendar. And it's a good process to work with. And the other thing is just to make sure that everyone in your organisation, not just the people who are involved in grants, understands what your need for funding is and is encouraged to contribute. So with many organisations that I work with, the first thing I do is provide them with a plastic carton, and they put it somewhere, and they tell all of the staff that it is to put fundraising and philanthropic stuff in. So if they get invited to a ball and they're not going to go to the ball, they bring the invitation in and put it in the box. It's the same for grants. If you read about an organisation that's been successful in achieving a grant, do some research on that. Why did they get the money? How much was it? Was it a particular time of the year? Is an organisation that might also support you? So having a sharing, learning organisation is a good thing. Everyone then feels part of the success as well as the research.
Fantastic. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you.